Hey, welcome back to another Bible Lounge. We're going to continue on in the Romans series. Today, we will be in Romans chapters 9, 10, and 11. This is going to be part 4 in our Romans series. Now, from the get-go, I want to say that these chapters are extremely challenging. There's a lot of interpretations on these chapters. They're very challenging chapters. Before we actually jump into the content, I just want to give an overall theme of this section. The overall theme is essentially Israel and the gospel, or really Israel's rejection of the gospel and the implications of that rejection. That's really what Paul's going to talk about in Romans 9, 10, and 11. So stick around and we're going to jump into Romans 9, 10, and 11. So before we jump into the chapters, there's a few things I need to bring to the surface or clarify or explain, okay? So first off, again, this section is all about Israel and the rejection of the gospel and the implications of that rejection. Now, I want to mention, in these chapters, we're going to hear a lot about election, right? So I want to say this before I jump into it, that the doctrine of election is not just a Calvinist doctrine, okay? I don't know if maybe you've believed that. I've heard that, right? I'm not claiming to be Calvinist. I'm not claiming to be Reformed theologian. I'm not claiming to be Arminian. I'm just trying to describe as unbiased as I can, as much as possible, what Paul is saying in the book of Romans. Paul clearly mentions election and calling multiple times in the book of Romans. So I want to put this out there that the doctrine of election, the teaching of election is a biblical thing. It's not something that only Calvinists and Reformed theologians hold to. Whatever side of the spectrum you land on, you still have to confront the issue of the doctrine of election. And Romans 9, 10, and 11 is going to be heavy with the doctrine of election. So it's important that I put that out there from the forefront. So you understand that if that is something that you had not understood before. All right. And so I guess we could just jump right into chapter 9. Romans chapter 9. So Romans chapter 9 can be summarized like so. God's promises to Israel are not made void. All right. So the whole premise of this chapter, Paul wants to show how because of Israel's rejection of the gospel, that has not negated God's promises to them, to the Israelites. In fact, it fulfills God's promises. The gospel fulfills God's promises. It doesn't negate them. So he starts off the chapter really sharing his heart. He shares his heart that he wishes the Jews would be saved. And this is from verses 1 through 5, essentially saying, I wish that I were cut off for the sake of my countrymen so that the Jews would be saved. And he says the reason why I wish this is because theirs belongs all the promises and the patriarchs, and through them came the Messiah. Through the bloodline of the Jews, Jesus was a Jew, came the Messiah. So to them were the promises of the Messiah and the coming kingdom and the restoration and all of that. The promises came through the Jewish bloodline. So Paul is saying it belongs to them. And then he goes on in verse 6, and he says this, it is not as though God's word had failed, for not all who are descended from Israel are Israel. This is going to get into something difficult here. What Paul is saying, and I'm going to try to explain this as unbiased as I can. What Paul is saying is not all of Israel are Israel. In other words, just being a person born of the descendants of the tribes or of Abraham himself does not make you inherently a true people of God. So he's using Israel here in two different ways. He says, for not who are all descended from Israel, that's the nation, are Israel. So the first one is not everybody who's a descendant of the nation of Israel is actually really Israel in the sense of real people of God. Okay? In verse 7, nor because they are his descendants are they all Abraham's children. On the contrary, it is through Isaac that your offspring will be reckoned. In other words, it is not the children by physical descent who are God's children, but it is the children of the promise who are regarded as Abraham's offspring. Okay? So what he's saying is, look, Abraham had Isaac and Ishmael, right? Isaac and Ishmael. Did Ishmael become an inheritor of the promises of God? No. If it only depended on being a descendant by blood of Abraham, then Ishmael would also be a recipient of the promises. And he's not. It was through Isaac that the promises were made. And then from Isaac, it didn't spread to all of his kids. It spread to Jacob, right? It was Jacob and Esau. It didn't go to Esau. It went to Jacob. And then for Jacob, it went to his 12 tribes. So the point Paul is making is that physical descent does not mean anything in regards to salvation or being a person of God, being a person of promise. And that's what he's saying. So what matters is being a person of promise. So he continues on that topic. Not only that, but Rebekah's children were conceived at the time by our father Isaac. Yet before the twins were born or had anything good or bad, in order that God's purposes in election, there's that word, might stand, not by works, but by him who calls, she was told, the older will serve the younger, just as it is written, Jacob I loved, but Esau I hated. Look at this. So what Paul is saying is before Jacob and Esau were even born, God had already decided that the promises would pass on through Jacob, right? So the point he's trying to make, the point he's making is that God himself has a plan. The promises are passed on to God's elect. There is an elect line of people ultimately that leads to the Messiah as far as the Jews are concerned, but there are elect line of people of faith, of people where the promises would count towards. And so all of this to say that all of Israel is not actually all of Israel. That Israel as a nation in terms of God's promises kind of mean nothing, but only those whom God has elected inside of the nation of Israel. Only those who are true people of faith. Okay, like David was a true person of faith. Saul was an Israelite, but he was wicked. There was plenty of wicked people of Israel. In fact, I think the sons of Korah, they were of the tribes of Israel, were they not? And they came against Moses, and the earth swallowed them up. They were destroyed. So there are people in Israel who are not people of faith, and this is essentially what Paul is saying. They're not people of the elect. They're not chosen. And this is hard to stomach. Now remember, I'm not claiming to be a Reformed theologian, but this is basically what he's saying, that this depends on God's election. Now this doesn't negate our choice, and I'm not going to get into all that. I just want to teach sorry, I hit the mic. I just want to teach what Paul is saying, okay? And then he goes on, he says, what then shall we say? Is God unjust? Not at all. For he says to Moses, I will have mercy on whom I have mercy, and I will have compassion on whom I have compassion. In other words, God has a plan. That's it. Is God unjust? No, because he has a plan. God will have mercy on whom he has mercy, and he'll harden whom he has hardened. He'll harden. It's God's will. Who are we to say anything? And in fact, Paul says this. It does not therefore depend on human desire or effort, but on God's mercy. And then he uses Pharaoh, how God hardened Pharaoh. He uses that example. And then he poses another question. One of you will say to me, then why does God still blame us? Right? That's a good question. If it depends all on God, then how am I at fault if I don't accept, or if I'm not a chosen person and accept God? Well, here's what his answer is. But who are you, a human being, to talk back to God? Shall what is formed say to the one who formed it, why did you make me like this? Does not the potter have the right to make out of the same lump of clay some pottery for special purposes and some for common use? And so basically he's saying, who are you to question God? Right? God has a sovereign plan, and no matter what side of the spectrum, Calvinism, Arminianism, you land on, this is truth. There are people of promise. And guess what, believers? All of those who place faith in Jesus are people of promise, right? If you're concerned that God hasn't chosen you, well, receive Jesus, and now you're a person of promise, right? That's the way I look at it. As simple as that. And you'll be a person of promise. So I don't want to get into the debate on elect or non-elect or all of this. I'm just trying to teach what Paul is saying. The theology behind that is the tricky stuff. But this is what he's saying. And he says, what if he kind of puts forth this idea that what if God was willing to endure making people for his wrath, and of course that breaks his heart, in order for those to be objects of his glory, right? That's just what Paul, a hypothetical thing. We don't know if that's the case. Paul just kind of puts that forth. And then he also includes, and also from the Gentiles. Like God wanted to include the Gentiles. And that's sort of how he closes this chapter. He quotes a bunch of scripture basically showing how the Lord is now including the Gentiles into that promised line, right? See, that promised line was only in the tribe of Israel. It was only given to the Israelites, and only inside of Israel were people becoming the promised line. Now, of course, there was outliers like Rahab and stuff who were people of faith, but nevertheless, God has now opened up the promises to be able to go out to all of the Gentiles via the gospel. And really, that's how he summarized, that's how he closes Romans chapter 9. So Romans chapter 9, it's, look, the Jews, all of Israel are not actually all of Israel. There are true Israelites who are people of promise, people of elect, people who God has elected. And now that election has opened up and gone out to the Gentiles as well, so that there are the elect of the Jews and there are the elect of the Gentiles. And I like to define it as this: the elect are people of faith. People of real faith, biblical faith, whether Old Testament, New Testament. Descendants of Abraham are people of faith because Abraham himself was a person of faith, was he not? Remember, Abraham was told that his faith was counted as righteous. So everybody who follows in those footsteps of Abraham, whose faith is counted as righteous, remember Romans chapter 4, justification by faith. It's through faith we attain righteousness. So the elect is now opened up to all of those who are of faith, now to the Gentiles as well. That's Romans chapter 9. Romans chapter 10. Romans chapter 10 can be summarized like this: Israel failed to receive the righteousness by faith. And just as it sounds, that's what this chapter is all about. So Paul goes into the truth, the reality. He describes the reality that the Israelites rejected the gospel, right? The gospel message was righteousness by faith. The Jews rejected that message. They were standing on their merits in the law. In fact, that's why the Pharisees killed Jesus, right? They were rejecting him. They were rejecting who he was. They were standing on their righteousness, their own merits. And we learned already through the rest of this book that there is none righteous before God, no, not one, and that includes the Jews. We learned in chapter 7 that Paul's struggle as a Jew meant that he couldn't please God because he was in the flesh. He needed to now pursue God in the spirit. And that was through faith. And so what he's saying here is the Israelites rejected the gospel and therefore are rejecting the faith, the righteousness that comes by faith. Sorry. They are rejecting the righteousness that comes by faith. They are trying to establish their own. He says, brothers and sisters, my heart's desire, and this is verse 1, and prayer to God for the Israelites is that they may be saved. For I can testify about them that they are zealous for God, but their zeal is not based on knowledge, since they did not know the righteousness of God and sought to establish their own. Just what I've been saying. They are seeking to establish their own righteousness according to the law. This is what Paul says that Moses says. Moses writes about this righteousness that is by the law. The person who does these things will live by them. So if you keep the whole law, you will live by them. But we already saw in Romans 7 that that's impossible, that the law made sin worse. And so it killed the Jews under the law because of sin. And then so there's the other way, and it's through faith. In fact, this is that famous passage in verse 10, for it is with your heart that you believe and are justified, and it is with your mouth that you profess faith and are saved. He's trying to show that righteousness is obtained through faith, not through merit. See, it's Christ's righteousness that is imputed to us when we believe. It's not our righteousness. We can't stand on our own righteousness. And so, in verse 16 he says, but not all Israelites accepted the good news. And then he quotes a bunch of passages proving that Israel has basically denied the gospel, and also how the Gentiles have been saved. Like, I was found by those who did not seek me. I revealed myself to those who did not ask for me, right? The Gentiles. He quotes this, all day long I have held out my hands to a disobedient and obstinate people. He's basically just pointing out, look, the Jews have failed as a whole to receive the righteousness of God through faith. And that essentially is Romans chapter 10. Romans chapter 11. So Romans chapter 11 can be summarized like this. God is not finished with Israel. Simple as that. But this chapter is not simple. In fact, this is the chapter I've been dreading the most to share, and I will do my best to share it. And like I said, is some stuff in here. Okay, there's a lot on election here, and there's some stuff in here that's very challenging. I think there's going to be a point where some of my interpretation is going to come forward rather than just a summary of what Paul is saying. But it's very hard to summarize what Paul's saying without having some form of interpretation. So I'm going to do my best to be unbiased to one or the other interpretation and just summarize what he is saying at face value. But again, there is going to be some interpretation. So let's jump into it. Paul asks yet another question, as he has been doing in Romans. I like how he asks questions in Romans and then answers them. I think they've all been a no. And he does this again. I ask then, did God reject his people? By no means. So in other words, remember in chapter 10, Israel failed to receive the righteousness by faith. So essentially, since they failed that and the gospel has gone out to the Gentiles, Paul asks, did God then reject his people? Is that what happened? And he says, by no means, no way. I am an Israelite, myself, a descendant of Abraham from the tribe of Benjamin. God did not reject his people whom he foreknew. Do you not know what scripture says in this passage about Elijah, how he appealed to God against Israel? Lord, they have killed your prophets and torn down your altars. I am the only one left, and they are trying to kill me. If you guys remember that story with Elijah, he was complaining that he was the only one left. And what was God's answer to him? I have reserved for myself 7,000 who have not bowed the knee to Baal. So too, at the present time, there is a remnant chosen by grace. You see what Paul's saying? If God has rejected his people, then Paul wouldn't be saved. But Paul's saved. Paul's a Jew. So how could God have rejected his people? In fact, the apostles were Jews. Barnabas was a Jew. All the original disciples were Jews. So God has not rejected his people. In fact, it's the opposite. His people have been called and the elect have been called out, right? So remember, we learned that there is the nation of Israel, and then there are Israel, the true people of God. Now, the nation of Israel is just a nation, and that's where the promise is and the law came. But there are true people of God, true people of faith, known as real Israel. And the Gentiles and Jews who believe in Jesus are a part of real Israel. And so what he's saying is, Paul is saying, look, I'm a part of real Israel. I'm a Jew by blood, but I have sought a righteousness that is through faith, is essentially what Paul is saying. So Paul himself, and he says, he is a remnant chosen by grace. And he says, and if by grace, then it cannot be based on works. If it were, grace would no longer be grace. So again, it's through faith. It's through God's grace and us believing in faith to attain that righteousness. And this is what the Jews has rejected as a whole, as a nation. But there are some Jews in the nation of Israel who are Jews who become real Israelites in the sense that they become people of God, like the apostle Paul. And then he asks another question. What then? What the people of Israel sought so earnestly, they did not obtain? The elect among them did, but the others were hardened. See, that's what he's saying. That very thing, that there are some in Israel who actually became real Israel, real people of God, like Paul, Peter, they became real people of God, whereas the rest of the nation of Israel who rejected the gospel message were hardened. Right? We saw that with the Pharisees. We saw that with most of the crowds. They were hardened to the gospel, but we saw some who received the righteousness by faith and followed Jesus. And those were of the tribes of Israel. And then he goes on in verse 11. This is where it gets very tricky, but I'm going to start reading it. Again, I ask, did they stumble so as to fall beyond recovery? So now he's saying, so now because of all Israel has rejected the gospel, is that it for them? Are they done away with? Not at all. Rather, because of their transgression, salvation has come to the Gentiles to make Israel envious. What he's saying is, look, no. In fact, God's allowed them to stumble. We've seen this before. Remember when God took the Israelites, the nation, out by Babylon into exile in order to bring discipline, in order to bring correction so that they would come back in and worship him? is kind of a similar thing where God has now allowed them to stumble. God has caused them, if you will, to stumble. We'll learn that later, that because he's hardened them, and some of them were called out like Paul, and the rest were hardened, because of that, the Jews like Paul and Peter and stuff, they went out and shared the gospel to the Gentiles. So now God today is working primarily in the Gentile world. The way that God worked in the Jewish world, in the Old Testament, he worked primarily through the Jewish nation. Now today, God works primarily through the Gentiles. And that's because Israel was hardened for a time. So now God's working primarily. This doesn't mean that the Gentiles have replaced Israel. This isn't replacement theology. I'm not teaching that. What I'm teaching is this. What Paul is saying is the gospel has gone out now to the Gentiles. And this is in hopes of making the Israelites jealous and envious. But if their transgression means riches for the world and their loss means riches for the Gentiles, how much greater riches will their full inclusion be? So in other words, he's saying, if because of their rejection of the gospel, the Gentiles were brought in, how much more if they receive the gospel will the Gentiles be blessed? The whole world will be blessed on account of that reception. Then verse 13, I am talking to you Gentiles. Now he turns attention to the Gentiles, right? We saw earlier in chapter 7, he turned attention to the Jews. Now he's turning special attention to the Gentiles, those who are non-Jews. Inasmuch as I am the apostle for the Gentiles. So this is where we hear that Paul's an apostle to the Gentiles. I take pride in my ministry. Why? In the hope that I may somehow arouse my own people to envy and save some of them. Paul wants the Jews to be jealous of God working through the Gentiles because he wants them to be saved. For if their rejection brought reconciliation to the world, what will their acceptance but life from the dead? And then he starts going on some analogies. If the part of the dough offered as first fruits is holy, then the whole batch is holy. If the root is holy, so are the branches. He starts going on this analogy, just essentially saying, look, Gentiles owe it to the Jews, right? Like we're not saved apart from Israel. We're saved alongside of and because of Israel. Because of their rejection, now we're brought into the people of God. Remember, there is the Israel inside of Israel. There's the nation of Israel, and then there's Israel, the real people of God. The Gentiles now are brought in to be a part of the real people of God, Israel, and that's because of Israel nation's rejection of the gospel. And then he goes on this analogy of a tree. He says, if some of the branches have been broken off, and you, though a wild olive shoot, have been grafted in among the others, and now share in the nourishing sap from the olive root. Nourishing sap is probably the promises, all the stuff that Israel as a nation were given, the patriarchs, the promises, all of that. Now he's likening the Israelite nation, the Jews, as branches, and the Gentiles as branches who have been grafted in. He says, do not consider yourself to be superior to those other branches. If you do, consider this. You do not support the root, but the root supports you. We don't support the root. It's the promises God made to Israel is what the Gentiles are now brought in to receive and be recipients and participants of. So that's very important for Gentiles to remember. So we can never boast against the Jews. He says, you will say then, branches were broken off so that I could be grafted in. Granted. So some Jews fell away so that some Gentiles can come in. Yes, that's kind of the analogy here. But they were broken off because of unbelief, and you stand by faith. That's true, but it's because of their unbelief. And we are brought in because of our belief. It all stands on faith in God's grace. But he says, do not be arrogant, but tremble. For if God did not spare the natural branches, neither will he spare you. This is interesting. I don't know how to there's two ways of interpreting this. That the Gentiles as a nation, as a whole, if we're talking as a whole, all Gentiles can be cut off, hypothetically. Or if we're talking about individuals here, right? I think he's talking about individuals because he's talking about faith. But again, this is where it gets into some of my interpretation. It looks like a stern warning from Paul that the Jews who in their unbelief were cut off and the Gentiles in belief were brought in, now those Gentiles who are brought in belief can also be cut off. For if God did not spare the natural branches, neither will he spare you either. So don't boast now that you're a part of the Israel, the real Israel, don't boast against real Israel, because God can easily cut us off as the same way he cut off the natural branches. Does this mean that you can forfeit your faith? I don't know. It's what it kind of sounds like, but there are other passages in the Bible that kind of hint at the once saved, always saved. Again, this is difficult stuff. I'm still trying to figure out where I stand on this. I'm constantly back and forth. I think scripture kind of seems to convey both, that we are once saved, always saved, but at the same time, there does seem to be scriptures that say it's possible for us to, I don't know, forfeit our faith. I'm stuck. I'm challenged. I don't really know where to stand. And so we just have to take this at face value. Somehow, some way, whatever's Paul's teaching, there is a cutting off of Gentiles that can happen. That's what he's teaching. Whatever that means, I don't want to get into the interpretation. Verse 22, consider therefore the kindness and the sternness of God, sternness to those who fell, but kindness to you, provided that you continue in his kindness. Look at that. There's a call for the Gentiles to continue. He says, otherwise you also will be cut off. I don't know how to get around this. To me, it sounds like he's saying, you Gentiles who have been grafted in and were now part of the real Israel, people of faith, remember, you can also now be cut off if you don't continue in the kindness of God. But we learn in chapter 8 that God is working everything in our lives to bring us to redemption. How do you reconcile these? I don't know. For some reason, God is promising that we have assurance in him, but at the same time, there does seem to be a case where we still have to continue in him. And it's not just God working, it takes both of us. Maybe that's this relationship aspect. How these coincide, it's difficult. But we just have to take what Paul is saying here at face value. Okay? And he says, and if they do not persist in unbelief, the Jews, they will be grafted in, for God is able to graft them in again. So in other words, any Jew who decides to stop unbelieving and believe can be grafted right back in. After all, if you were cut out of an olive tree that is wild by nature and contrary to nature, were grafted into a cultivated olive tree, how much more readily will these, the natural branches, be grafted into their own olive tree? In other words, if the Gentiles, since the Gentiles were brought in to the true Israel, the true people of God, the people of faith, then so too the Israel nation, any of those who are in the Jews can also be grafted into the true Israel of God if they believe, and that's going to be easier because they're natural branches that were cut off, is kind of what he's saying. Now, this is an analogy. We can't take the analogy too far, but Paul's just saying, look, it's easier for God to save some of the Jews than he is for God to save all of the Gentiles, right? Or to save Gentiles. What that means, I don't know. Basically, it all comes down again to faith. Israel's rejected the gospel by faith. They were cut off. The Gentiles received the gospel by faith. They were brought in. We have to continue in faith to stay connected to the tree. The Jews, if they stop disbelieving and believe, they will be brought back in to the tree, right? That's a summary of his analogy. He says, I do not want you to be ignorant of this mystery, brothers and sisters, so that you may not be conceited. Israel has experienced a hardening in part until the full number of the Gentiles has come in, and in this way all Israel would be saved. The Jews have been hardened so that God can work into the Gentile world and bring about salvation to the elect of the Gentiles that God has reserved. That's the doctrine of election. Now, again, I'm not preaching the sovereignty, that, and I don't claim even Reformed theology, but this is just what he's saying. There is a number of the Gentiles that God knows will be saved. Of God's elect. It's not that who he knows will be saved. It's his elect. It's both. It's whom God foreknows, and God has elected them. The implications of that, the workings on how that looks, if it's according to his foreknowledge, if it's he chose them because he knew they were going to have faith. I'm not going to get into that. What Paul's saying here is there's a number that God has of the Gentiles. When that number is completed, he says all Israel will be saved. And remember, all Israel doesn't mean the nation of Israel, most likely. All Israel is now the real people of God. There's a number of the Gentiles that need to be added to the real people of God to be saved. And then he goes on in verse 28, as far as the gospel is concerned, they are enemies for your sake. But as far as election is concerned, they are loved on account of the patriarchs. For God's gifts and his call are irrevocable. Just as you who were at one time disobedient to God now have received mercy as a result of their disobedience, so they too have now become disobedient in order that too may now receive mercy. So this is what Paul's saying. Look, the Gentiles were at one time separate from God. Remember, the Israelite nation was chosen to be people of God. They were given the law and the promises. The Gentiles were excluded from that unless they came by faith and became nation of Israel per se. As a whole, the Gentiles were excluded. Now, because of Israel's disobedience and unbelief, the gospel has went out, and now the Gentiles are included and can become people of God, real Israel. And this now made the Israelites, who were the promised chosen race of God, now they're how the Gentiles were. They're the ones who are rejecting God. They're the outsiders. They're the ones that are on the outside of the fence, if you will. And so what God is saying is, what Paul's saying is, God has allowed God himself to work in the Jews. God has worked in the Jews to allow them, the patriarchs and stuff. And then now he's working in the Gentiles. And both of them have experienced basically being put in a state of disobedience. And the reason why? God has assigned all to disobedience because righteousness can only be attained by faith. We have to all accept the righteousness that is by faith. And the Jews, now that they're assigned to disobedience, now they will begin to see their need for a righteousness by faith. And that is essentially what Paul is talking about here. And then he closes with this doxology and basically saying, well, the mind of God, who can know it? In other words, Paul's like, it's just too much for my head. And I say this about the same chapter. It's just too much. All this election and Israel and the true Israel of God, it's difficult. I understand it's difficult. But, you know, I had to teach it, and ultimately that's chapter 11. Chapter 11 is all about the fact that God's not finished with Israel, and the main reason is because there's two Israels. There's Israel, the nation, and there's Israel, the real people of God, and that's made up of Jews and Gentiles. So God can't be finished with Israel because the promises go forth now to also include the Gentiles who are included into the real people of God, Israel. I hope that makes sense. This was a very challenging 3 chapters. I hope that I brought clarity. If not, feel free to leave a comment. Maybe I could repost. I don't know. But these were challenging. I did my best. And I will see you when we finish in Romans chapters 12 through 16, part 5. We will finish on the next video, and I hope to see you in that video.